Am I good to start?
I'll let you know when it's all set up. I'm sorry. Yes, I think we're all set up.
Great. Prime Minister, the floor is yours.
Okay, cool. Starting 3, 2, 1. Environmental degradation is theft. The Bolsonaro government is trying to steal the ground underneath people's feet, which comprises their homes and clean drinking water. And it has already stolen things like the ability to get political representation through all other alternatives. This is how you hit them where it hurts. I'll talk about a couple of things. I'll start with the stance and generally how you weigh up this debate. Then I'll talk about why this is the most effective opportunity for you, why alternatives are either not viable or are drastically improved when you do this. And finally, what happens in the long run, why all of these are improved when you start with eco-terrorism and vigilantism. So before that, the stance of the model as to what this looks like. What it looks like to pursue vigilantism is things like property destruction, things like guerrilla tactics that are often used among people in the Amazon. It looks like operating in dense areas where you have familiarity with the terrain in places like rainforests and areas that are going to be used for mining, things like sabotaging mining equipment, destroying subsidiary infrastructure like roads, things that are very, very costly to replace. Obviously, you can make prioritizations based on what is going to hit these companies the most and where it will hurt. We're going to do things like property destruction and all those types of things that will damage those companies. Often this debate will probably propose a bunch of countervailing solutions also. They'll probably talk about things like lobbying local governments, things like pursuing international media attention. I want to know two things about this. Number one, preemptively, like we can do this also. You can prioritize them in ways that are meaningful. Number two, we will demonstrate that vigilantism also improves all of these other outcomes, whereas they would not be viable for a lot of reasons in the status quo. We're going to demonstrate a couple of things are very, very important in this debate. Firstly, in terms of the weighing of what matters in this debate, we think there's an obvious principle in this round that's extremely important, but also not the most important thing. There's an obvious principle given that this is one, literally self-defense of the territories that are being stolen from you and things that will actively destroy you for hundreds of years, things like the devastation of villages, things like the poisoning of drinking water. This is a last resort given that you were deprived of other legal mechanisms of recourse by the Bolsonaro government. This is the best option given that you did not opt into the state, so you should not be expected to go through legal mechanisms in the first place, and this is proportional to them stealing homes from you. We think there's an obvious principle, but we also think we'll win on the pragmatic benefits foremostly. The environmental impact of preserving the environment matters most for a number of reasons. Why is it the case that environmental preservation is absolutely important in this debate and matters more than just the weighing of like perhaps a few more skirmishes for Indigenous people or perhaps the sacrifice of individuals in the Indigenous community? Why is this important? Number one, this is a wide-scale self-preservation for Indigenous communities because you absolutely rely on the Amazon as a collective. You rely on it for your homes, your villages, you rely on it for clean drinking water, for food, for all these things that sustain the livelihood of your community into perpetuity. This matters significantly more than the lives of a few individuals within the movement. Number two, because beyond just the self-preservation is a critical community connection, which is to say that Indigenous groups see the value of environmental protection as intrinsically tied to culture and self-importance. Things like the fact that nature is valued intrinsically equal, if not more than the lives of human beings themselves, means you ought to prioritize it. We think that the long-term perceptions of the communities are not that important because one, these are speculative. You don't know how people will perceive your community in like 20 years from now. The changing of norms or how they perceive you or whether they think you're violent is not something you can either predict, control, or something that you should meaningfully base your calculus off of. This is entirely speculative, so it's not something you should care about. So why is this the most effective option for you to use? There are a number of reasons why this is uniquely effective. Number one, it's a very, very effective form of resistance because either you are likely to win these types of conflicts right now, or these things become costly enough for companies and the government that they are no longer going to be pursued in the future. Why? Because firstly, these are extremely costly forms of property destruction. This is critical mining equipment that's extremely costly to replace. Things like destroying roads that lead to that are subsidiary and important for these types of operations often really result in a time lag where they result in months to years to replace and extremely costly for these companies. Number two, you actively know the terrain better than these companies do. You are accustomed to what types of things are incredibly important in terms of trade routes, in terms of passages. We know you have the terrain and the ability to understand which types of things are most costly. Number three, in the war of attrition, you are most likely to win, given that you can sabotage critical equipment that takes a massive amount of time to rebuild. But this also incredibly raises costs for these types of corporations that are often international in scope and rely on investors and shareholders to get this amount of capital in the first place. Because notably, notably, there is a massive amount of raised costs, meaning for shareholders or investors who are looking at this relative to like the many other extractive projects that all exist either around the world or exist in the same area, but are not doing the same things and facing the same resistance. These are all other options for the investors and shareholders who are specifically funding these companies. They do not have to fund you. There's not a deficit of other companies that either are not facing this resistance because they operate elsewhere or are not engaged in this type of environmentally destroying procedures. This means it matters for those large companies because they're massively likely to lose funding. So you are likely to win this war of attrition at the end of the day. The impacts of inaction are huge, and I want to make this clear. The impact of inaction is both the destruction of your homes right now, but is also in the future. You need to make sure you do not have mercury in your waters for the next 200 years. Quite literally, mining operations in Papua New Guinea in the 80s have literally been determined that they will poison waters with zinc for literally the next 300 years. That is something that you cannot stand for as an indigenous community, both in terms of your own self-preservation, as well as for the fact that this intrinsically harms the natural environment. Given that this increases cost for companies, they are unlikely to win this war of attrition. They're unlikely to feel this is viable in the long run. Why are other alternatives never going to be viable? And even if they are possible, they are improved under our side. One, lobbying is not viable insofar as these groups do not have the capital to create tangible repercussions. Two, they have the inability to get media attention insofar as this is not a significantly important issue if you don't make a big deal out of it. But furthermore, they're a significant minority and aren't able to command that same level of attention. Three, there's no negotiating power if you don't have any existing bargaining chips. Here's the thing, even if OO proves in some extent that negotiations can be viable, they won't meaningfully be listened to beyond a symbolic, just like try to have a negotiation, but they will uniquely get better under our side. Why? Firstly, because now you actually have a bargaining chip on the table insofar as these companies significantly lose money and are unlikely to be viable. But secondly, it's just the Overton window in these cases. When you have some sects that are actually being extremely radical, it means the government is more likely to want to stop this and listen to people who seem more reasonable within that movement. I'll take a POI from closing.
If I was being attacked, would it be morally legitimate for me to pick up a small child and beat the other person to death with it, even at the expense of that child's life?
Yes, if found to be consistent with our principles, then absolutely, because we've given you all the weighing as to why this matters most to you. So finally, given that we've proven the alternatives are not viable, you are likely to make them all more effective insofar as op might prove that they may work if you use this as a bargaining chip that is both a tangible threat and also something that chips the Overton window and the calculus of the government. Finally, here is why this is actually uniquely going to be better in the long run. Firstly, this is the most effective way for you to ever get international attention. The only reason this is a motion at the Yale IB is because vigilantism has been used. This is uniquely something that breaks the mold of what is the otherwise like standard news of just environmental degradation, which is frankly an old story that no one uniquely cares about. When people are actually taking up arms and taking down corporations, that's uniquely when people care. But finally, preempting the arguments from op about escalation. Here's why escalation does not matter. One, because if they make this argument that like private companies will hire private militias, that entirely concedes all of our impacts about this being really costly and something that's going to hit them where it hurts, because it requires you to spend massive amounts of money on militaries. But furthermore, you have an advantage. This is not a conflict where just throwing money will help, because this is asymmetric warfare on a terrain that you know best. This is the best thing for you to do as a group. It protects yourself. You ought to stand for self-defense, and this is the most effective we propose.
Great. I thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now to open up our bench, I call upon the leader of the opposition. Here.
Okay, can you hear me fine?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, consequentialism and impacts are a principle. You cannot pursue the act of doing something if it means that your tribe or your indigenous group is no more and doesn't exist into the future. We are going to talk about potential alternatives which we think are safer, but we're also going to tell you why vigilantism creates a greater amount of force used against these indigenous groups, and why this also means that if there is extinction on either side of the house, the extinction that goes down in history that is bloody and murderous is far worse for the memory of these indigenous groups. Let's start off with what those alternatives are. Of course, you have to note, when the Amazon rainforest was burning, a ton of media organizations spent a lot of their budgets catering specifically to these stories, creating, the famous cover photos of the Amazon rainforest lungs burning, the fact that there is a lot of hurt being experienced there, and the fact that in many cases, it has led to the things that we use in everyday life to be purchased in a certain sense of unethical ways. That's the word. Secondly, there have been a protest internally against Bolsonaro and his government, right? So even during the COVID-19 pandemic, prior to that, when he just came into office, even before that, when Dilma Rousseff was still president, there have been people who have consistently protested against the state, and they've managed to achieve certain types of benefits. So why are these alternatives useful, and why are they nice to have as a part of our toolbox? First thing to notice, when we do boycott most of these companies, we hit them at the vast majority of where their profits are. So they care about these things, obviously, because that's would necessarily threaten their continued existence. There are also political consequences for the campaign once these protests are up and running. So Bolsonaro is wildly unpopular in Brazil at the moment. He has to face re-election, I think, in 2 years' time, on the back of failing in the COVID-19 pandemic, but also on the back of destroying indigenous land. A lot of young people have started to mobilize against him. If you do continue these protests, and they realize as a party that they're likely to lose the election, there is the ability, or at least the incentive, to ease back on most of those aggressive logging procedures. Let's go into what the bulk of this debate is: vigilantism. Firstly, you must note that it isn't just like destroying equipment, it is also directly using a threat of force against these companies, right? Of course, you can say it is a legitimate way to defend yourself, but once a company sees that a threat of force is being used against them, by law, they're allowed to respond in an equal amount of force themselves. Many of the time, this means that loggers and companies with massive amounts of resources that have the ability to pool private security companies together, use subcontractors, etc., can now overrule and overrun these individuals that actually attack them. So it is like, if you're comparing people who are fighting for their lives in principle against those with a vast amount of resources, they're almost always likely to lose that battle. The bargaining chip that they talk about on opening opposition, an opening government, only works insofar as that group actually has political legitimacy to begin with. And most of those groups aren't even represented. So this bargaining chip, unlikely to work. If they can just securitize themselves and fight back against indigenous communities, then all of the principled stuff that you guys are talking about are screwed, because those things don't actually actualize in giving them more land in the future. Second thing that I want to note here is that indigenous communities in Brazil are currently two things. Firstly, they are sparsely located, but also there are quite few of these groups. So any existential threat against this specific group threatens the continued existence of indigenous communities that existed so sparsely between certain places that they're unlikely to recover from that, right? So if you are using a ton of men to, go up against these companies and they are hurt in the process or killed in the process of that, you hurt the continued existence of groups that are already on the brink of extinction in the first place. So that threat to continued existence is bad, because you lose the entire history, the entire relevance, and the prevalence of the reason why these communities even exist to begin with. I'll take CG.
So I think OG makes his point already. If corporations are at the point where they're buying like military groups at large, surely it's just cheaper to get a contract and work legally on legal land.
Yeah, I mean, where would you? I mean, that's something you'll have to make from OG. Surely, just use legal land. What is the parameters of that in the debate? I mean, maybe it's a possibility. I don't know. That's for government to give a policy for in this debate. The third thing I want to do is weighing, because I think this debate is going to come down to a stage where we're going to talk about, extinction of this group is inevitable, right? For many of them, as sad as it is, for many of them, whether it's fighting a corporation or fighting the gradual decrease of their land, there's a threat to their existence. Why is the threat on our side at least more palatable? Firstly, a gradual decrease of land is what is happening in the status quo. So Bolsonaro notices that he complains about the big expanses that is too big for these indigenous communities. It doesn't mean that they are taking their land back all at once. But even if that was the case, it is better than going out in extinction, fighting, but also in a murderous, brutal fashion where you don't have the ability to recuperate against that. I think the crucial link here is why is there likely to be a sense of violence coming from these companies in the first place? Of course, we've already spoken about why force is used in vigilantism, but you have to note that these companies don't, when they log, like when Cadbury or whatever logs in Brazil, they don't use Cadbury logos and whatever. They use subcontractors by which they can hide the identity of that company to begin with, which means they have a sense of legitimacy, like through mercenaries and private security, to actually enact these acts without facing the direct consequences thereof. There's just no accountability in this, and you're likely to see the end of these indigenous communities in a very brutal fashion.
Great. I thank that speaker for those remarks, and I'll call upon the DPM to continue the case for side government. Hear, hear.
Cool. Okay. Can I just check that you guys can hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Nice. Cool. Let's start in 3, 2, 1. I want to start my speech by just referencing the really ugly weighing that we saw, but I get you have to as opposition in this round, which is you might have extinction anyway. We might as well do it in the most peaceful way and avoid it. Let's just have a couple of things really cleared, because we understand that your prospects of full success are really low on both sides because of your nature. Number one, we genuinely think that it is a massive assertion to say that it is not better to possibly go out fighting or trying as much as you can to make your situations better. But importantly, here is the weighing here. If it is true that your community is so desperate and you are actively at the risk of extinction, we think what the route or policy you should follow, or in general, what is better for the world for them to follow, is even if they have a risky and hard chance of warding off their attackers, if that chance is there, you follow the route that has that chance and has that viability of success. All of Eric's speech was not about how this is principally great, but how it's principally justified. But more importantly, this is the best course of action that community has. And finally, I just want to dispel the idea that on their side of the house, this extinction isn't absolutely brutal. Your children dying from mercury poisoning in front of you is a very brutal way for your community to face extinction. And there's no guarantee that if you let them keep encroaching into your territory, they don't eventually come so far that it actually just becomes a violent conflict, because they are literally in your homes at that point. Our policy is the best in that it gives us the best fighting chance to ward off these intruders. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to focus more on the practical and rebut opening opposition quite heavily. Then I want to talk about the principle, because it seems like CEO wants to talk about that. Couple of things. Number one, opening opposition has this line that consequentialism is a principle too. We concede that a lot of our arguments on how we have better consequences. Next, they have one line of rebuttal, or they have a set of alternatives. Protest against the state, boycott the companies. Bolsonaro will lose because he's unpopular because of COVID, and young people are environmentalists and they're likely to possibly change the tide of politics. Couple of observations. Number one, I think a fair number of these are false, in that I do not think boycotts against these companies have worked to any extent. The protests against the state has not succeeded at all. Bolsonaro has resulted in more indigenous communities losing their land over the past 2 years than they ever have in Brazilian history. These protests have done absolutely jack shit. Also, because I don't know if you know this, but in Brazil, they are much less critical of Bolsonaro's Amazon policies than they are in the West. They care more about his lack of good COVID policy, right? That's a big difference over here. What that means is that even if Bolsonaro loses, there's no guarantee that the next person won't equally just turn a blind eye to companies which have strong lobbies that then absolutely destroy your areas. Okay, but number two, even if this is completely true, notice how every example they gave is enacted by different actors. So boycotting the companies is not something indigenous companies do. They're not a consumer base. Protesting against the state is not something indigenous communities have in their competitive advantage, because they aren't a voting bloc. Instead, we think those people who are going to do these other things will do it anyway, even if you are going to do some level of sabotage, because they recognize the dire threat of climate change and the dire threat of all of these resources being wiped out. They are committed to the cause and willing to literally fight against a semi-autocratic country. They're not going to be turned off just because they see indigenous communities being violent. In fact, a lot of them really agree with that violence. Okay, so at the end of the day, alternatives are either as good on our side or just not sufficient. Now let's go on to the argument on how this is exceptionally effective. This is the one where OO completely drops the bomb, pretends like we don't have analysis, but we really do. What did Eric tell you? Couple of things. Number one, this is what like a type of conflict that you are very good at doing, and you are capable of like putting significant costs onto these companies if they make the decision to illegally encroach on your land. You can destroy infrastructure that is really key to them and therefore make it more expensive. What was the mechanism on how this gets them to change their decision and leave the encroachment? Number one, as OO concedes, if you want to fight against this, you might have to hire things like private military or literal bodyguards to go around your infrastructure. This is really expensive, and it shifts the costs now. It is no longer worth the resources you would get additionally by moving into this area. It is more cost effective for you to just stay out, not take on the additional cost of having a private military, and restrict your profits to the resources you extract from the legal areas that you've been assigned, and not go into like illegal Amazon territory that the indigenous community has. But also, we told you how like this is something that affects investors and other individuals who are deciding whether to put their money into a company or not, when they know that that company has to deal with their pipelines being blown up or their tractors suddenly disappearing. It is something that shifts the calculus of where capital goes. It means companies are much less likely to invade on your indigenous territory because you've shifted that cost capital. No solution they have has come close to giving you this level of solvency. And that's why we're really winning this debate on impacts. Before I go any further, I'll take that COPOI.
So the info slide says that you're around these areas. Do you not think, not necessarily that you're in them, that you're around them for the vast majority of cases? By your own analysis, would you not do a risk assessment, be afraid of the fact that there's violence if it costs as much as you say, and the majority of companies just not do this? Enter them.
I don't know, that sounds like a really good thing. I probably really misunderstood your POI, but that was the point. You do a cost analysis and decide not to enter indigenous territory and that you've not been assigned, and that is a good thing. We like that. It saves your community because now your river no longer has a mercury in it, and that's good. Okay, now why the alternatives are really bad are things that Eric has already laid down to you. Why you can't lobby, why you can't get into negotiations because you have no bargaining chip against them, why the media doesn't cover you at all. We also explained how every single one of these alternatives becomes better when you do this policy, because you now have leverage. You can say we can tone down the level of attacks if you take back the level of encroachment that you have onto our territory. These are all options you only have, these are all options indigenous communities only have if they do this policy, and that's something that we uniquely give on our side of the house. At the end of the day, the metric as to what we should try to go for in this debate is the side that helps the most vulnerable community that is existentially at threat. It gives them the best chance of surviving. We have shown why we achieve that, and we give the best chance. Even in the long term, we explained why even if you have escalations and these companies hire private militaries, it's a fight that we are far more capable of sustainably carrying out because of the asymmetric nature of guerrilla warfare, of how we, like, the objective is far easier to damage a couple of pipelines than to defend it from every single attack. And it doesn't matter if you throw money at it or you throw high tech at it, because of the nature of the terrain and the type of warfare you're doing, it's still one where you can fight far better than any alternative that opposition has given us. Finally, on the principle, Eric told you about self-defense, where there's no alternative and it's proportional. Let's go further on. Property damage is mainly what we're talking about. That's completely legitimate. It's a proportional response. Number two, even if you end up hurting innocent people who are working for these companies, it is the duty on them to not work for a terrible, horrible company that is causing significant harm. And even if they choose not to exercise that duty, you as an indigenous community should not be forced to put up with your suffering because it is inconvenient for other people and because they need like a horrible industry to make a living. At the end of the day, this is principally justified, and the best means you have to preventing extinction go with opening government.
Great, I thank that speaker for those remarks. And now to call the DLO to close out the top half of this debate. Hear, hear.
Thank you. Can I check if I'm audible enough?
Yep, loud and clear.
Cool. Yeah, let me turn my video on and see. In case the bandwidth goes low, I'll just turn it off. For points of information, kindly put them in the chat. And then if we get to 5 minutes, 5 minutes 30, I still haven't taken you, just feel free to unmute yourself and then I'll engage the government bench. Excuse me. Okay, let me just set my timer then. Cool. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, the situation of those people is very dire. On both sides of the house, the people or the indigenous people of the Amazon need to choose a strategy of engagement that gives them the best chance to survive, right? Regardless of like what their circumstances are. And what we argue from opening opposition today is that the strategy that is suggested by the motion particularly harms those people and drives them towards extinction. That is to say, if we want to have a principled debate here, we can say it's justified to legitimately defend yourself. That is fine. Defend yourself in the best way possible. What we think is not legitimately justified from opening opposition is taking a stance to defend yourself when that stance to defend yourself literally drives you to extinction, when there are other measures or other stances that you could have taken that could have given you a chance of survival. This is exactly where we win the principle of self-defense, in that this stance of fighting back is not self-defense at all. It's actually leading yourself and your people towards extinction, and also in a manner that can be termed as justified from the side of the people that fight against you. This is why opening opposition wins. Let's talk about opening government, because I think they give a case that clashes perfectly with my constructive matter. So all of it is going to sound like rebuttal. It's integrated. Three key things that we get from the Prime Minister. The first being that environmental preservation is important because these people rely on the Amazon for food, etc. The second is that all the other alternatives that we could talk about, the idea of like lobbying, for example, is made more effective by these people literally carrying out acts of vigilantism. The third one is that you win these things, you either win the battle or they become costly to replace, so that these companies will give up eventually. Let's talk about why all those arguments don't hold any water in this debate. The first thing to say here is that this argument is predicated on assumption that these companies do not respond and adopt to these attacks, right? That is to say, these companies do not engineer responses to sabotages. We think that this in of itself is something that is not true, right? We think that the companies that decide to enter and venture into these lands, for example, they also want to protect their capitalistic investment. So at a point in which you start attacking them or carrying out acts of vigilantism, them with all the sources of money that they have and the engineering capabilities that they have are far more likely to be able to engineer barriers around their property, around all the things that they need to ensure that they're even far more difficult, for example, to sabotage. That means that per every sabotage you make, you are far less likely to be able to do the same sabotage again because you'll find a protection mechanism. At the end of the day, what you do is you run out of things to do, and eventually that doesn't get you anywhere. Because understand that we're not talking about people who are gambling here. We're talking about the people who are investing in these like operations, knowing that there is so much more to gain. So we're talking on a comparative about people who are willing to invest millions, right, and millions of dollars to ensure that their operations pay off. So the idea that, well, these things are going to become too costly to replace at the end of the day is like a really nonsensical idea, right? Because it's never going to become too costly to replace if there's enough money to set it up and even more money to maintain those operations in the first place. So already acts of vigilantism are a losing action. That it means that they are not going to be able to push those people away, right? That's it. The second thing here to say, the second response is that like this has been unsuccessful already, like acts of vigilantism have been unsuccessful in a number of ways because they've been carried out, right? And I implore you to look at the info slide and what it tells us. It tells us that the only success that those people have achieved is success against illegal miners, for example. Comparatively to big corporations, illegal miners are people that don't have enough resources to begin with. That means their equipment is inferior to begin with. They cannot afford protection mechanisms for their equipment to begin with. Compared to like big corporations, these are big corporations that have been given the leeway by Jair Bolsonaro's government to enter into these areas. That means then these corporations are far more likely or far more able to defend themselves. On the alternative, this fight of self-sustenance or this fight does not even at all begin to bear fruit regardless of how you want to think of it, right? This guerrilla warfare thing is legitimately not going to work. That's the reason why it works with illegal miners, because they cannot protect themselves and they don't have the state backing. So the question is, do we fight a battle that leads us to extinction? Because understand what I've done in my speech so far is to prove to you why this fight is less likely to work. But the very important thing that we have to talk about in this debate is how these people, like if you consider them, they don't really have enough power or enough legitimacy to be able to stop this thing against themselves. So they depend on allyships from other people who might put enough economic pressure or enough social pressure on the government or also on these corporations to withdraw, right? Let's talk about what actually these acts of vigilantism do to the very effort of the people who are outside, who are able to help them, the people who sympathize with those people. To begin with, we think that the success of all the fights of the people outside depends on the legitimacy of the voice of the people outside, and also depends on the legitimacy of the cry of those people who are indigenous people. The point at which you carry out like vigilantism, for example, what vigilantism does is that it justifies why Jair Bolsonaro and also these corporations ought to retaliate because it's a protection of private property. That means it legitimizes them to fight against you with a force that you are unable to bear. What that means then is that the word of the people who are supporting you from outside now clashes with the word of someone who is defending their property. Before I expand on this further, I'll take a point from closing. Opening.
Saying extinction is not a meaningful counterfactual when the alternatives are both not proven to work and also not mutually exclusive, and when the info slide literally says there is relative success with minimal losses, given the nature of these as decentralized.
So I think you're over 15 seconds. You're over 15 seconds. Relax, rest. So the counterfactual, right, which is what we are proposing, is quite effective. Why? Because there's also a sense of principled legitimacy to say that whenever you attack a people that are defenseless, then you incur upon yourself the wrath of every other person who wants to rise to the defense of those people. At a point at which these corporations can stand and say, well, we are defending ourselves and we're protecting our private property by virtue of encouraging these people to carry out acts of vigilantism that have even been sanctioned by the government, understand that Jair Bolsonaro is someone who is pro-industry, and as Francois talks to you about, he was someone who's seeking to gain re-election, for example, right? That means he is someone who's far more likely going to be able to give these people the leeway to engage with these minorities. You've said yourself that in the past 2 years, these people have lost so much land, right? Jair Bolsonaro is not going to effectively give those people any protection at the point at which you give them a reason to not warrant this protection. That in of itself means it makes it difficult for the people outside to fight for those people, because these people and their entire survival depends on the people outside. On our world, these people could survive. These people could adapt. We think that give them the chance to outlive Jair Bolsonaro, give them the chance to outlive and also adapt. And we think that survival is the key thing, rather than driving yourself to extinction through these means that are not justified.
Great. I thank that speaker for those remarks. I thank all speakers on the top half for what was a fine debate so far. I now call upon the member of government to extend the case for side government. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep.
Cool. Before I start my speech, first, POIs in the chat. Secondly, content warning. Descriptions will be fairly graphic. I'll be mentioning, of course, the genocides and whatnot. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So 3 things in this speech: novel, substantive, extending from opening government. The first thing we're going to do is explain why, in a scenario where even if the logging does not harm the environment all that bad, or even if they have alternatives, like maybe they have other trees or other rivers, why the entrance of logging companies still represents genocide, as they dehumanize these individuals and commit crimes at the behest of their paramilitary forces they will use anyway. Secondly, why it is the case that it's okay to harm these workers, even if they are ostensibly innocent or even if they were just being ordered. And thirdly and lastly is, simply put, why it is the case that even if companies have lots of money, so conceding to the best ground, the opening opposition, that they will like bring their guns, they will bring in contractors and whatnot, and invest billions in the military, why we will still succeed. Before that, though, some response. The only response I want to bring out is to this last point that I don't think is responded to by OG, which is just the point about allyships from people who place economic pressure on them. First, you yourself said they stand to make billions from this. So even if there is some form of economic pressure imposed on these people, clearly it cannot be the case that it'll lower to the point where it would still be unprofitable. Like clearly it is still profitable to some degree. The question is whether or not this economic pressure is more powerful as a consideration than the other things we'll be mentioning. And I'll explain later why the economic pressure is simply less effective than actual violence and vigilantism. Secondly, why is it that violence is the thing that changes their mind? If they were sympathetic, surely they would be sympathetic to the plights of these people who are simply fighting back against an attempted genocide by the police forces and the paramilitary forces employed by these companies. If they were doing it while not being particularly sympathetic to these people, then it cannot be the case that they would be investing in these people in the first place. So like either it changes or it doesn't change, but regardless of whether or not it changes, it should not change based on this particular thing. Okay, having moved on, first, substantive. We believe that assuming the logging doesn't destroy them, the entrance of these corporations illegally is still tremendously violent and something that needs to be defended against. The Yanomamis, at the behest of Brazilian companies, were killed in the 1987 gold rush by gold miners who saw them as subhuman. The Akes in Paraguay, who had 85% of their population chopped to pieces by timber and mining companies because they refused to move their homes and work in slave contracts. Massacres of indigenous Guatemalans by mobile police forces manned and funded by paramilitary groups. It is this disrespect which is heralded by the entrance of these logging corporations that is the beginning to their extinction, and we need to stave this off as fast as possible. That is to say, allowing them to set up, allowing them to have some authority and control over these areas, allowing them to build their own police forces and their own stations in these areas is something that we need to fight back against and something that we need to rail against heavily. Why is it the case that we really, really care about kicking these people out? The first is we want to prevent them from having the time to set up these things, but secondly is because these things are often a prelude to further exploitation and abusive slave contracts and taking away your land formally through the law and just ensuring that life is really, really hell for you. So even if you allow them to get in, it is not as if the extinction is any kinder to these people. So no, if it is extinction on both sides, you pursue the one that slows down to protect other tribes in your name, you pursue the one that gives you a chance to survive, and you pursue the one that spits in these people's faces. They do not deserve to make money from it, even if it is the case to get genocided on both sides. Secondly, what about the situation, which I think CO might bring up, which is, aren't these workers innocent? There are three reasons why, even if they are ostensibly innocent, why they are not innocent in truth. First of all, the idea that they were just following orders is not an excuse. They opted into these jobs. They signed contracts of these jobs. Like, there are historical records of these things being perpetuated by gold miners themselves and by timber miners. So realistically speaking, they had full information going into these things. At the very least, before going into it, they picked up guns and shot these people, right? So realistically speaking, they knew these things were happening. Secondly, though, even if they didn't know, these people still make money off of your graves. These people still make money off of your babies not having enough nutrition to survive. These people still make money off of these things. But thirdly and lastly is that they also benefit subsidiarily from the benefits the state provides them. So realistically speaking, these workers are not in a more vulnerable position than you. We think it is fair and justified for you to defend yourself, even at the behest of a more innocent actor, even if at the behest of an innocent actor, because ultimately speaking, this is about weighing off which protection is more important. You have the right to protect yourself and your own identity. Beyond that, you also have a responsibility to your own group and your own tribe who contribute to your own existence, as well as who, like, I don't know, help you survive and live with you and are part of your culture, as opposed to these workers you barely know. You have the right to defend yourself and prevent yourself from being driven to extinction. Thirdly, then, why will this be a successful endeavor? But I just want to point out that two principal extensions fill in two very important link work gaps in opening government, where we explain that even if there are some moral concerns, the principle outweighs quite thoroughly, and we weaponize all of the self-defense points from opening government. Secondly, why will this be a successful endeavor? Using all the things like tree spiking, hit and run tactics in the middle of the night, sabotaging roads and supply lines. There are 5 separate mechanistic links as for why, even if these corporations are rich and they're still willing to invest large amounts of money in paramilitary forces, why they will not succeed. 1, workers become substantially more afraid to work for these companies in high-risk areas. As the cost becomes higher, corporations are forced to pay these workers a substantially higher salary across the board. They're forced to spend more on these people, and they have less money to pay for things like guns, because they're forced to pay workers higher because less people are willing to work for them. Secondly, operations themselves take longer as they're forced to detrap regions, forced to set up defensive perimeters and bring more supplies.